On my daughter's wedding day, I stood at the back of the church while another man walked her down the aisle. She raised her glass during the toast and told 200 guests she had always wished for a different father. Then she hugged her father-in-law and laughed. I set my champagne down, placed an envelope on the gift table, and walked out. But when my daughter tore open that envelope later that evening, her perfect new life cracked right down the middle. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what country you are listening from. $55,000. My daughter said the number like she was ordering coffee. She didn't even look up from the magazine spread across her kitchen island, one of those thick bridal glossies with women in dresses that cost more than my truck. I stood in the doorway of her Remuera townhouse, cap in hand, work boots wiped twice on the mat because her floors were the kind of pale timber that showed every scuff. Everything in that kitchen gleamed. White marble bench tops, copper pendant lights, a fridge with a screen on it. I didn't know fridges needed screens, but apparently in my daughter's world they did. Dad, look at this venue. She tapped a photo with one manicured fingernail. Mantels on the water. This is where professionals get married. This is where Nathan's friends have had their weddings. I could see Auckland's harbor through her living room window, real harbor views she paid a fortune for, and here she was showing me pictures of water in a magazine as though I'd never seen it before. My throat went dry. I'd driven 2 hours from Hamilton that morning. Took the Waikato Expressway, stopped at Henley for petrol and a pie, rehearsing the whole way what I'd say. I'd saved some money. Not a lot, but enough to help with flowers, maybe the catering, whatever she needed. I'd imagined her face lighting up. Imagined her saying, "Thanks, Dad, that means the world." Instead, $55,000. The flowers alone are $9,000, she continued, flipping pages. The photographer is $6,000. The dress I want is $4,500, and that's a bargain. She turned another page. Nathan's cousin had a $10,000 dress, so really, I'm being reasonable. I set my cap on the edge of her bench, then picked it up again because it looked wrong there, like it belonged to a different house entirely. Which it did. Tessa, love, I have $18,000 in savings. That's everything I've got after 42 years in the building trade. I could maybe talk to the bank about a loan, but $55,000. She closed the magazine. Not gently. Slammed it shut so the other one slid across the marble. $18,000? She stared at me like I'd offered her a handful of gravel. Dad, other fathers remortgage their houses. They sell their cars. They cash out their Kiwi saver. What are you willing to do for your own daughter? Those words hit me like a nail gun to the chest. I'd raised this girl on my own after June died. Worked 6-day weeks so she could have school uniforms without holes in them, so she could go on camp, so she could attend university and become the marketing executive she was now. I'd built half the houses in the Waikato and all I had to show for it was a bad back, a modest place in Rototuna, and a daughter who was staring at me like I'd let her down by existing. Tessa, I could try for a loan, but $55,000. I looked around her gleaming kitchen. You're doing well for yourself. Maybe we could find something more modest. More modest? Her voice went sharp. You know what Nathan's father is spending on his niece's wedding next year? $70,000. And he didn't even hesitate. She pushed back from the island and crossed her arms. I'm 33 years old, Dad. This is my one chance to have the wedding I deserve. My friends' fathers would do anything for their daughters. But you? She looked at my old Swandry jacket, my calloused hands, my boots that had been resold twice. You're just a disappointment. Disappointment. The word sat in the air between us like something broken. I wanted to tell her about the years of early mornings, scaffolding in the rain, concrete dust in my lungs. About the medical bills from June's cancer that had eaten through our savings like termites through soft pine. About doing the best I could with what life handed me. But my voice wouldn't come. You've had 42 years to build something, and this is what you've got. $18,000. She walked to the front door and opened it. The pohutukawa tree in her front yard was starting to bloom, red flowers against the December sky, and I remember thinking how beautiful it looked and how ugly everything inside this house had become. Just go, Dad. I need to think. The door closed behind me, not quite a slam, but firm enough. I stood on her front step, keys heavy in my hand, staring at my old Hilux parked between her neighbor's Audi and a Range Rover across the street. The summer air smelled like salt and jasmine. Auckland was beautiful that afternoon, and I'd never felt more out of place in my life. June, I whispered to nobody. Our girl just called me a disappointment. The drive back to Hamilton took 2.5 hours because I missed the turnoff at Mirror. My hands wouldn't stay steady on the wheel. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered. A 3-bedroom weatherboard I'd renovated myself in the 1990s, when Tessa was still small enough to sit on my shoulders while I nailed weatherboards. The paint was faded now. The rose bushes June had planted along the fence were getting leggy, and I kept meaning to prune them but hadn't found the reason to. Inside, the silence pressed down on me. I turned on the lamp beside June's reading chair. She used to sit there in the evenings, marking up real estate listings for houses we'd never afford, dreaming out loud about Tessa's future. She's going to do something special, Cliff. I can feel it. Mark my words. The photos on the hallway wall told a story I wasn't sure I recognized anymore. Tessa at age 5, grinning in her school uniform, front tooth missing. Tessa at her year 13 formal, holding my arm like I was the most important man in the world. Tessa at her university graduation, hugging me so tight I could feel her heart beating. In every single photo, she was looking at me like I mattered. June, what happened to our girl? I spoke to the empty house, and the empty house said nothing back. I made a cup of tea. June's blend, the Lady Grey she'd ordered from that shop in Cambridge because the supermarket stuff wasn't right. I still bought it, even though the tin cost $14 and I had to drive 20 minutes each way. Habits are hard to break when they're tied to someone you loved. The bank statements lived in a shoebox under the bed. NZ Super brought in about $520 a week. My Kiwi Saver had $8,000 left after I'd used most of it for June's palliative care. Savings account held $18,000, every cent I'd scraped together over 42 years of honest work. The mortgage was paid off, at least. Small mercies. But maybe. I picked up the phone and dialed the ANZ 24-hour line. The automated system walked me through menus until a real person answered. This is Priya, how can I help tonight? I'd like to inquire about a personal loan. My voice came out steadier than I expected. $40,000. Let me pull up some options for you. Can I take your name and date of birth? While she typed, I thought about what June would say about this kind of risk. She'd been the cautious one, the budget keeper, the one who said we don't need flash, we just need enough. But she'd also said once, when Tessa broke her arm falling off the monkey bars and we couldn't afford the specialist, you do what you have to do for your kids, Cliff. Even when it scares you. Especially when it scares you. Priya explained I'd need to come into the branch. Bring identification, proof of income, documentation. She was gentle about it, the way people are gentle with old men doing things they probably shouldn't. I wrote down the appointment time on the back of a power bill and went to bed, though I didn't sleep. The ANZ on Victoria Street looked exactly like a place designed to make people like me feel small. Glass doors, polished floors, young people in suits moving with the kind of purpose that comes from knowing where you're going. I straightened my good shirt, the blue one June had bought me for our 30th anniversary, and checked my folder. Pension statements. Kiwi Saver balance. 42 years of continuous employment history from Galbraith Construction. Not my company, despite the name. Just a coincidence that my boss shared my surname. I'd been an employee. A good one, but an employee all the same. The loans officer, a young woman about Tessa's age, gestured me toward her desk. Her name badge said Danielle. Mr. Meredith, I understand you're interested in a personal loan. Please, sit down. Yes. $40,000. It's for my daughter's wedding. Danielle's fingers moved across her keyboard. I watched her expression as the numbers appeared on her screen. Polite, professional, but something shifted behind her eyes when she saw my income. I can see you're receiving NZ superannuation and have a small Kiwi saver balance. Your credit history is very clean, which is positive. She paused. However, given your age and income, we'd be limited in what we can approve. The maximum would be $35,000. The interest rate for your profile would be 15.9% per annum. She turned the screen toward me. I couldn't make sense of all the numbers, but the ones I could read made my stomach tighten. The total repayment would be just over $52,000 over 5 years. Your fortnightly payment would be approximately $400. $400. Out of my super. That would leave me about $120 a fortnight for food, power, petrol, everything. She's worth it, I said. Where do I sign? Danielle pulled out forms but kept looking at me with that careful expression. Mr. Meredith, I have to be transparent. This loan would put significant pressure on your budget. If anything unexpected came up, a medical bill, a car repair. I understand the risks. She's my daughter. The paperwork took an hour. Other customers came and went, doing normal banking things while I signed away my financial safety net. Danielle explained every clause, every penalty, every scenario where this could go wrong. She was thorough. Kind, even. But she processed the application because the numbers technically worked, even if barely. The approval came through that afternoon. Danielle printed the cashier's check and slid it across her desk with something that looked like reluctance. $35,000. Combined with my savings, $53,000. Not quite the 55 Tessa wanted, but close enough to make a father proud. Thank you, I said, tucking the check into my jacket pocket. She'll be so happy. Walking back to my truck, I felt something unfamiliar. Not quite pride, but something like it. I was 67 years old, living on a pension, and I'd just found a way to give my daughter her dream. Maybe I wasn't the success she wanted me to be, but I could still provide. June, I did it. I actually did it. I drove to Auckland the next morning, the check in an envelope on the passenger seat. 2 hours of farmland and motorway, rehearsing the moment I'd hand it over. I parked outside Tessa's townhouse, walked up the path past the Pohutukua, and rang the bell. She opened the door in activewear that probably cost more than my grocery bill. Dad? What are you doing here? I held out the envelope, almost shaking with excitement. Tessa, love. I went to the bank. I took out a loan. Here's $53,000 for your wedding. Everything you need. She stared at the envelope. Not with joy, not with gratitude. With pity. The kind of pity you'd give a child who brings you a drawing when you're busy. Oh, Dad. She let out a small laugh that broke something inside me. That's not necessary anymore. Vince is covering the whole thing. He rang Nathan yesterday and said no daughter-in-law of his would have anything less than the best. He's paying for all of it. The words landed like a punch. I stood there, arm extended, holding an envelope that represented every dollar I had and every dollar I'd borrowed, and she'd already moved on. But I took out a loan. 15.9% interest. Well, just return it then. She was already turning back toward the kitchen, where I could see bridal magazines fanned across the bench again. Vince understands what a wedding should look like. He's been incredible, honestly. Finally, someone who gets that I deserve better than cutting corners. Better than cutting corners. That's what 42 years of my life amounted to. Corners she wanted cut off. When did Vince offer? I managed. Yesterday afternoon. Right after we spoke, actually. She paused, hearing how that sounded, but didn't correct it. He said cost was irrelevant when it comes to family. Yesterday afternoon. While I was lying awake in Hamilton, doing sums on the back of a power bill, hating myself for not being enough, Vince Ashby had made one phone call and erased me. The venue is Mantell's, she continued, flipping a magazine open. Vince booked it for the whole weekend. And the photographer did the Prime Minister's nephew's wedding, apparently. She looked up briefly. Dad? You've gone pale. Just tired, I said. Long drive. I should get this money back to the bank. Good idea. No point paying interest on a loan you don't need. She was already studying flower arrangements, humming to herself. Then, as I reached the door, thanks for the thought, though. That's sweet of you. Sweet. Like I was a pensioner who'd brought biscuits to a dinner party. Sweet. I sat in my truck for 15 minutes before I could drive. My hands were shaking, and the envelope sat on the passenger seat looking like the most expensive mistake I'd ever made. The harbor sparkled through the windshield, boats cutting white lines across blue water, and I thought about how Auckland had never felt like my city. Too fast. Too shiny. Too certain that people like me didn't belong. I drove straight back to Hamilton, straight to the ANZ. Danielle was still there, just finishing her shift. She looked up with surprise when I walked in. Mr. Meredith. Is everything all right? I need to cancel the loan. Whatever the penalty is, I'll pay it. Her face softened. The early termination fee is $350. Are you sure? I'm sure. I don't need this loan anymore. She processed the cancellation without asking questions, though I could tell she wanted to. The check went back across her desk. The $350 came out of my savings. And I walked out of that bank with less money and less dignity than I'd walked in with 24 hours earlier. At home, I made June's Lady Grey tea and sat in her chair. The evening light came through the window, catching dust motes in the air, and I talked to her the way I always did when the house got too quiet. She called me sweet, June. Like I was a child who'd tried to help and failed. When did our girl decide I wasn't enough? The photos on the wall didn't answer. But they reminded me that there was a time when I had been enough. More than enough. I'd been everything. My neighbor Stan heard me come home and wandered over with 2 bottles of Spites and a bag of hot chips from the dairy. Stan had been my mate since we played rugby together at Hamilton Boys High, back when our knees still worked and our futures still looked wide open. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just sat on the porch, handed me a beer, and waited. She doesn't want my help, I said eventually. Stan nodded slowly. The thing about kids, Cliff, is they don't always see what's in front of them until it's gone. We sat there until the stars came out over Rototuna, and he went home without saying anything else. But I slept better that night than I had in weeks. Sometimes knowing one person still sees your worth is enough to keep you standing. The wedding invitation arrived 2 weeks later. Thick cream card with gold lettering. The honor of your presence is requested at the marriage of Tessa June Meredith and Nathan Vince Ashby. The ceremony was at St. Matthew in the City, Auckland. The reception at Mantell's on the Water. December the 14th. I noticed they'd used June's name as Tessa's middle name. She'd always hated that name growing up. Funny she'd chosen to put it on the invitation. Over the next month, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Wedding planning meetings I wasn't told about until after they'd happened. Vendor tastings scheduled when I was supposedly busy, though nobody had asked me. A growing list of events where my presence would be awkward or inconvenient for people who mattered more than I did. The engagement party invitation came with a phone call. Dad, it's at Vince's place in Herne Bay. His friends will be there, business people, developers, that sort of crowd. She paused. Maybe it's best if you sit this one out. You know how those things can be. You'd probably find it uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. She meant I'd embarrass her. I'd stand in Vince Ashby's waterfront mansion with my Hamilton accent and my calloused hands, and her new family would see exactly what she'd come from. What about the dress fitting? I asked, because June had always talked about being there when Tessa chose her wedding dress. It was one of those mother-daughter moments June had dreamed about, and since June couldn't be there, I'd wanted to stand in. Tessa hesitated. You can come, but please don't talk too much. And wear something decent. Do you even own anything appropriate? I wore my anniversary shirt and my good trousers to the bridal boutique on Ponsonby Road. The place was all mirrors and white carpet, dresses displayed like museum pieces behind glass. Tessa's friends were already there, 3 women in designer outfits discussing photographers and florists with the casual authority of people who spent money the way I spent tea bags. Everyone, this is my dad. Tessa's introduction carried something I'd never heard in her voice before. A faint apology. He's old-fashioned, but he means well. Old-fashioned. I stood in the corner while they discussed hemlines and beading and the merits of cathedral-length veils, feeling like a trogdye who'd wandered onto the wrong building site. Present but unnecessary. Hired to watch, not to participate. Your dad seems lovely, one of them whispered to Tessa, loud enough for me to hear. It's nice that you include him. Include. Like I was a charity case she'd graciously allowed into her world. That night, I drove to Hamilton Park Cemetery. June's headstone was simple, the way she'd wanted it. White marble with her name and dates and the words she'd chosen herself before she died, she loved deeply and without condition. I knelt beside it and pulled weeds from around the carnations I'd planted in the spring. I can't keep doing this, June. She's ashamed of me. The girl we raised, she looks at me and sees someone she has to apologize for. The cemetery was quiet except for the motorway in the distance. I'd always found peace here, but that night felt different. That night felt like the last page of something. You remember what the social worker said, all those years ago? That someday she might want to know where she came from. I brushed dirt from the headstone. Well, maybe someday has arrived. I drove home slowly and stopped at the warehouse for a writing pad. The letter took me 4 nights to write. 6 drafts, each one torn up and started again until I found the right words. The final version was 2 pages, front and back, in my best handwriting. I sealed it in an envelope with the adoption certificate and a newspaper clipping from 1993, yellowed at the edges, about a car accident on the Kaimai Range that had killed 2 young parents and left an 18-month-old girl orphaned. When I put the envelope on my kitchen table next to the wedding invitation, something caught my eye. The ceremony time on the invitation said 2 o'clock. But I distinctly remembered Tessa telling me on the phone that the ceremony was at noon. 2 hours different. I stared at the gold lettering until it blurred. I rang Stan. What time does your invitation say? Stan paused. I'm not invited, mate. But hold on, let me ask Karen from next door. She's going. He came back a minute later. Karen says 12 o'clock. My invitation said 2. There's your answer, Cliff. Stan's voice was quiet. She doesn't want you there for the ceremony. She wants you showing up after someone else has already walked her down that aisle. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after I hung up. The envelope with the adoption papers sat beside the invitation, and I understood finally that these 2 documents belonged together. One was a lie she'd designed. The other was a truth she'd earned. St. Matthew in the city looked beautiful in the December sun, its brick and stone warm against a perfect summer sky. I pulled into a car park on the street at 11:55, 5 minutes before the real ceremony time that I wasn't supposed to know. Through the heavy wooden doors, I could hear the organ playing. Not prelude music. Processional music. The ceremony was starting without me. I adjusted my tie, the same black one I'd worn to June's funeral, and pushed through the doors. The church was full. 200 people in their finest, heads turned toward the aisle where Tessa stood in white, radiant, breathtaking, holding the arm of Vince Ashby. Vince, in a charcoal suit that cost more than my truck, walking my daughter toward her future with the confidence of a man who believed he'd earned the right. An usher caught my arm. Sir? Are you looking for a seat? I'm the bride's father. The confusion on his face told me everything. He glanced toward the front row, where Vince's wife sat beaming, where the groom's family occupied every seat of honor, where there was no space reserved for a retired builder from Hamilton who'd driven 2 hours to watch a stranger give his daughter away. "I'll stand at the back," I said. So I did. I stood at the back of St. Matthew in the city and watched Vince Ashby walk my daughter down the aisle. I watched him kiss her cheek and hand her over to the groom. I watched 200 people who didn't know I existed witness the most important moment of my daughter's life, a moment she had deliberately stolen from me with a 2-hour lie printed on cream cardstock. The ceremony was beautiful. I'll give her that. The vows were personal and well-written. The readings were thoughtful. The minister spoke about love as a choice, not just a feeling, and I almost laughed at the irony. Because I knew something about choosing to love someone. I'd been doing it for 31 years, ever since a social worker placed an 18-month-old girl in my arms and said, "She's yours now if you want her." After the ceremony, I followed the crowd to Mantell's. The reception room sparkled, white linen, crystal glasses, harbor views through floor-to-ceiling windows. The scent of lilies and roses filled the air, probably that $9,000 flower arrangement my $18,000 hadn't been good enough to cover. I collected a glass of champagne from a passing server and found a spot near the back, close to the gift table. "Dad." Tessa spotted me during the receiving line, her face showing relief and something else I couldn't quite read. "You made it. Sorry about the confusion with the times. Probably just a printing error." "Probably." I smiled. "Congratulations, love. Let me introduce you to some people." She turned, then stopped. "Actually, Nathan's aunt is waiting. We'll catch up later, yeah?" She moved on, and I stood there holding my champagne, watching her work the room with the effortless charm of someone who'd spent her whole life learning how to manage people's expectations. Including mine. The envelope was in my jacket pocket. I brought it from Hamilton that morning, sealed and ready. Inside were 2 pages of handwriting, an adoption certificate, and a newspaper clipping that would change everything she thought she knew about herself. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad. I was something quieter than both of those things. I was done. Guests began gathering for the speeches. Nathan's best man told stories about university. Tessa's maid of honor talked about friendship and growing up together. Then Tessa stood, champagne glass raised, the afternoon light turning her dress to gold. "I want to thank everyone who made today possible," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "But especially Vince." She found him in the crowd, and her smile widened. "Vince, you've shown me what it truly means to have a father who cares. All my life, I've wished I had a different father. And now, standing here, I feel like that wish has finally come true." The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of agreement, but the sharp, sudden quiet of people who've just witnessed something cruel and don't know where to look. I felt eyes flicker toward me, then away. Champagne glasses stayed frozen midair. A woman near me put her hand to her mouth. Even the photographer lowered his camera for a moment, unsure whether to capture what was happening. "Vince, you're the father I never had." Tessa walked toward him, arms outstretched. He embraced her with obvious pleasure, the kind of satisfaction that comes from winning something you didn't earn. Around me, whispers hissed like water on a hot pan. Guests studied their shoes, their fingernails, anywhere that wasn't my face. A few managed polite, uncomfortable applause that died almost immediately. I didn't move. I stood with my champagne glass steady in my hand, watching my daughter embrace a man she'd known for 2 years while dismissing the man who'd spent 31 years choosing to love her. No anger on my face. No tears. Just the calm understanding that this was who she was, and I'd finally stopped pretending otherwise. I set my glass on a table. Walked to the gift table. Placed my envelope among the pile of beautifully wrapped presents from Vince's wealthy friends. Then I turned and walked toward the door. No confrontation. No scene. Just a 67-year-old man removing himself from a place where he was clearly not wanted. Behind me, the reception slowly resumed its noise, guests pretending they hadn't just watched a daughter publicly disown the man who'd raised her. The car park was quiet and warm. Summer in Auckland, the kind of evening that should feel like a gift. I climbed into my Hilux, started the engine, and sat for a moment looking at the harbor through the windshield. June, I said to the photo I kept clipped to the sun visor. I finally did what needed doing. She needs to know the truth. The drive south felt different from every other drive I'd made between Auckland and Hamilton. This one felt final. Not angry. Not wounded. Just complete, the way a building feels when you've laid the last brick and stepped back to look at what you've made. My phone started ringing as I hit the Bombay Hills. Tessa's name on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. Dad, we're opening gifts. Some of these are amazing. Vince's business partner gave us a weekend at a lodge in Queenstown. Call me. The second call came 15 minutes later, somewhere around Hetley. Dad, where are you? We found your envelope. Why is it so heavy? Call me back. The third call came as I was pulling into my driveway in Rototuna. Her voice had changed. The champagne brightness was gone, replaced by something uncertain and thin. Dad, I opened your letter. This isn't funny. This can't be real. Ring me right now. I went inside, put the kettle on, and made a cup of June's Lady Grey. The phone buzzed on the kitchen bench. I let it ring. The fourth call was different. The voice on the other end wasn't the polished marketing executive or the bride who'd toasted her replacement father. It was a voice I hadn't heard since she was small, cracked and terrified. Dad, please. Tell me this is a lie. Tell me you're my real father. Please, Dad. I'm sorry about what I said. Come back to the reception. We can talk about this. But there was nothing to talk about. She'd spent months telling me I wasn't good enough, and now she'd discovered I wasn't even who she thought I was. Both things were true, in a way. I wasn't good enough for the life she wanted, and I wasn't the biological father she'd assumed. What I was the man who'd chosen her. The man who'd fed her, clothed her, read to her, held her when she had nightmares, sat through school plays and netball games and university lectures, and buried his wife still loving the daughter they'd been given by tragedy and grace. The calls kept coming. 12. 20. 31. The voicemails grew increasingly desperate. I listened to a few, each one a stage of grief compressed into 30-second bursts. Denial. Anger. Bargaining. She offered to pay back the money I'd never given her. She apologized for the toast. She demanded I answer. She begged. By the time the count reached 43, I'd finished my tea and packed a bag. Just the essentials. June's wedding ring in my shirt pocket. The photo from Tessa's university graduation, back when her eyes still held something that looked like love. My good tools, the ones I'd earned through decades of honest work. A change of clothes. The road atlas June used to keep in the glove box, dog-eared at the South Island pages because she'd always dreamed of driving down to see the glaciers and we'd never quite got around to it. Stan appeared on my porch as I was loading the truck. He didn't ask where I was going. He just handed me a thermos of coffee and said, "You've got my number, Cliff. Use it when you're ready." I clasped his hand. "Thanks, mate. For everything." He nodded once and walked back to his place, and I backed out of the driveway for the last time, looking at the house where I'd raised someone else's daughter as my own and loved every single minute of it until the minute stopped being enough for her. State Highway 1 stretched south through the Waikato evening. Golden light across farmland, black and white cows standing in paddocks, hills rolling toward the horizon like promises. I drove past Te Awamutu, past Te Kiti, past the limestone country where the road twists through native bush and the air smells like rain and fern. 43 missed calls by the time I reached Taumarunui. I turned the phone off. The thing about driving through the King country at dusk is that it strips everything down to what matters. The road, the land, the sky. No marble bench tops. No $9,000 flower arrangements. No cream card invitations with lies printed in gold lettering. Just a man in a truck, heading south because south was away from everything that hurt. June, I said to her photo on the dashboard. 31 years I gave that girl everything I had. Every dollar, every hour, every piece of my heart. And she stood in front of 200 people and said she wished I was someone else. The radio played a song I recognized from the 80s. Something about never giving up. I turned it off because I had given up, and that was all right. Giving up isn't always defeat. Sometimes it's the first honest thing you've done in years. I drove through National Park as the last light faded behind Ruapehu. The mountain was just a dark shape against the stars, massive and indifferent, and I found that comforting. Some things are too big to care about the small dramas of small people, and there's peace in being reminded of your own smallness when your smallness is exactly what someone held against you. Tessa wanted a different father. Well, now she had one. Vince Ashby could buy her expensive weddings and designer dresses and Harborview townhouses. But he couldn't give her back 31 years of bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes and drives to netball practice in the rain. He couldn't explain why she woke up some nights with a feeling of falling, the ghost memory of a car accident she was too young to remember. He couldn't tell her about the 16-year-old girl and the 20-year-old boy who died on the Kaimai Range one winter morning, leaving behind an 18-month-old daughter with no one in the world until a builder from Hamilton and his wife walked into Orna Tamariki and said, "We'll take her. She's ours." The adoption certificate told the facts. The letter told the rest. How June and I had tried for children for 8 years before the doctors said it wasn't going to happen. How the social worker had called one Tuesday afternoon and changed our lives. How Tessa had arrived with nothing but a blanket and a rattle and the most serious expression I'd ever seen on a baby's face, like she was deciding whether we were worth trusting. How June had held her that first night and cried, not from sadness but from the sheer impossible joy of being chosen by something bigger than either of us. We never told her because we never needed to. She was ours. Completely, entirely, ours. Biology didn't build this family. Choice did. And choice is stronger than blood, except when the person you chose decides you were never good enough in the first place. The highway signs counted down the kilometers to somewhere else. Wairau. Taihape. Mangaweka, where the old DC-3 plane sits in a paddock like a monument to things that once flew and now just rest. 51 missed calls by the time I stopped for petrol and bowls. The woman at the counter looked at my suit and my overnight bag and my tired face and said, "Long night?" "Long 31 years, I said, and she smiled without understanding, and that was fine. I slept in the truck at a rest stop outside Levin, the seat reclined as far as it would go, June's photo catching moonlight on the dashboard. In the morning, I bought a pie and a flat white from a bakery in Otaki and kept driving south, over the Rumutaka Range and into the Wairarapa, where the land opens up and the light is different, gentler somehow, less demanding. I didn't know where I was going. Wellington, maybe. Or the ferry across to the South Island, where June had always wanted to drive. Somewhere the air was clean and nobody knew my name or expected me to justify my existence. Tessa had made her choice long before that toast. The speech was just the first time she'd said it out loud. Every exclusion, every apology for my presence, every time she'd introduced me with that faint embarrassment in her voice, those were all the same speech, delivered quietly over months until she felt bold enough to say it in front of 200 witnesses. The adoption papers in that envelope would force her to reckon with something she'd never considered. Not just who she was, but what she'd lost. Not a biological father. You can't lose what you never had. She'd lost the man who chose to be her father when the world took everyone else away. The man who showed up, every single day, for 31 years, not because he had to but because he wanted to. Because she was his girl, and nothing in the world, not money, not status, not the approval of people with harbor views and $10,000 dresses, could change the fact that love is measured in presence, not in what you can afford. Vince Ashby wrote a check. I built a life. And if Tessa couldn't tell the difference, then the letter would do it for me. I reached Wellington by lunchtime and parked at the waterfront, watching the Inter-Islander ferry prepare to cross the strait. The wind was up, the way it always is in Wellington, and the harbor chopped with whitecaps. I bought a ticket for the 2:15 sailing and sat on a bench eating a sandwich, watching seagulls fight over chips. My phone had been off for 16 hours. I turned it on long enough to see 78 missed calls and a string of messages I didn't read. Then I turned it off again and boarded the ferry. The crossing took 3.5 hours. I stood on the deck watching the North Island shrink behind me, the hills of Wellington dissolving into blue haze, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Lightness. The unburdening of a man who'd put down a weight he didn't realize he'd been carrying until his shoulders straightened without it. June's photo sat in my shirt pocket, next to her wedding ring. The road atlas lay open on the seat inside, marked with a circle around a town in Canterbury where a mate from the building trade had retired 5 years ago and kept saying, "There's a cottage down the road if you ever want a change of scenery, Cliff." Quiet as. Good neighbors. You'd love it. Quiet sounded right. Good neighbors sounded like everything I needed. The rest, Tessa's calls, her panic, her sudden desperate need for the father she'd spent months discarding, that belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. I was 67 years old. Maybe 20 good years left if my back held up and the doctor's reports stayed clean. Those years were mine now. Not hers. Not anyone's. Mine. The South Island appeared through the mist like a door opening. Green hills, blue water, mountains in the distance wearing their last spring snow. I drove off the ferry at Picton and headed south through the Marlborough Sounds, past vineyards and olive groves and small towns where people waved at strangers because that's what you do in places where community still means something. "June," I said to the dashboard. "I wish you could see this. It's everything you dreamed about." The highway unfolded ahead of me like permission. No more begging for scraps of appreciation. No more standing in corners at events I wasn't wanted at. No more apologizing for being a builder instead of a businessman, for having calloused hands instead of a checkbook, for being the father who showed up every day instead of the one who showed up with money. Tessa wished for a different father. I hope Vince Ashby is everything she dreamed he'd be. I hope his money keeps her warm at 3 in the morning when she's wondering where she really came from. I hope his generosity fills the space where 31 years of love used to live. But I suspect it won't. Because money can buy a wedding, but it can't buy a father. It can't buy the man who held you through your first thunderstorm, or taught you to ride a bike in the park, or drove 2 hours each way just to hand you an envelope full of everything he had. Money can't replace the person who chose you when nobody else would. And when Tessa finally understands that, when the truth in that envelope settles into her bones and she realizes what she threw away for a toast and a round of applause, she'll look for me. But I won't be in Hamilton anymore. I won't be standing in her doorway with my cap in my hands, waiting to be told I'm not enough. I'll be somewhere south, in a quiet cottage with good neighbors, building something small and honest with whatever time I have left. And maybe, if she finds me, if she drives all the way down and knocks on my door with the same serious expression she had as a baby, deciding whether I was worth trusting, maybe then we'll talk. But she'll have to earn it. The way I earned her. One choice at a time. The road stretched ahead through Canterbury Plains, flat and golden, mountains standing guard on the western horizon. My thermos was empty, my back was aching, and the sun was getting low. But the cottage was only an hour away, and for the first time in 31 years, I was driving towards something that was purely, entirely, mine. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. And if this story made you think, carry this with you: the people who love you the most are often the ones you notice the least. Gratitude isn't something you feel only after loss. It's something you practice while they're still here, still showing up, still choosing you. Because one day, they might stop. And no amount of money, no fancy venue, no new name on an invitation can replace a lifetime of quiet, steady love. Thank you for watching.